Everyone laughed at them. That was the thing nobody wants to say out loud, but it was true. When the Tuskegee Airmen first arrived in the skies over Europe and North Africa, they were dismissed. Not quietly, not politely, but openly. German pilots flew past them with a kind of arrogance that comes from absolute certainty. Luftwaffe aces with kill counts painted on their fuselages. Men who had chewed through the RAF, torn through Soviet air forces, and sent Allied bombers spiraling into the sea. They looked at the red-tailed fighters and they laughed. These were black pilots flying for a segregated military that had spent years arguing they couldn't do it. These were men who had been rejected from flight programs, told by official government studies that their race made them biologically unsuitable for aerial combat. These were men whose country wouldn't let them eat at the same lunch counter, but somehow expected them to die in the same sky. And yet, when the accounting was finally done, when the missions were logged and the aircraft were tallied, and the histories were written in smoke and steel above the Mediterranean, the Tuskegee Airmen had shot down 112 enemy aircraft. They never lost a single bomber under their escort to enemy fighters. Not one. The men who laughed were the ones who didn't come home. If this is the kind of story that deserves to be told, stay with us. And if you want more history, the way it actually happened, subscribe now, because we are just getting started. To understand what the Tuskegee Airmen accomplished, you have to understand the world they were flying into, not just the war, but the America that sent them there. In 1940, the United States Army Air Corps had a simple policy. Black men could not be pilots. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't hidden behind bureaucratic language. It was direct, institutional, and backed by official military doctrine that cited pseudo-scientific studies claiming African Americans lacked the cognitive ability and emotional stability for aerial combat. These weren't fringe opinions held by a few racist officers. They were formal policy positions endorsed at the highest levels of the military establishment. The Army War College had published a report in 1925 that explicitly argued black soldiers were inferior fighters. That report shaped military thinking for nearly 2 decades. By 1940, as war clouds gathered over Europe and Japan, flexed its muscles across the Pacific, the United States military machine was preparing for the greatest conflict in human history, and it was doing so with one hand tied behind its back, deliberately, out of racism. But something was shifting. Civil rights organizations, black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, and activists across the country were pushing back hard. They called it the Double V campaign, victory abroad against fascism, and victory at home against racial oppression. The argument was brutally simple. You cannot fight for democracy overseas while practicing tyranny at home, and the pressure worked, at least partially. In 1941, the War Department reluctantly authorized the creation of a segregated black flying unit. They called it the 99th Pursuit Squadron, and they chose a location for training that was, in its own way, a statement: Tuskegee, Alabama, deep in the Jim Crow South, far from the eyes of Northern progressives, far from the kind of scrutiny that might make white officers uncomfortable. They put these men in the heart of segregated America and told them to prove they could fly. What the War Department did not anticipate was what these men were actually made of. The Tuskegee Army Airfield was built almost from scratch. The black community rallied around it. Tuskegee University, already a legendary institution founded by Booker T. Washington, provided academic and intellectual infrastructure. The surrounding community supported it, and the men who arrived to train there were not ordinary recruits. They were extraordinary. Many had college degrees at a time when college education for black Americans was a profound achievement, won against tremendous odds. They were mechanics, engineers, teachers, athletes. They were men who had spent their entire lives being told what they couldn't do, and had spent their entire lives proving that wrong. The training was rigorous. The standards were high. In fact, by some accounts, the standards applied to Tuskegee trainees were even higher than those applied to their white counterparts, because failure for these men wouldn't just mean one person washed out. It would be used as evidence for the entire argument that black men couldn't fly. The weight of a race's potential future in aviation rested on every landing, every maneuver, every decision made in the cockpit, and they rose to meet it. The first class of Tuskegee pilots graduated in March of 1942. There were 5 of them. 5 men who had beaten a system designed to stop them before they started, and at their head was a man whose name would become synonymous with the entire program: Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. Davis was the son of Benjamin O. Davis, Sr., the first black general in the United States Army. He had attended West Point, where he was subjected to a practice called silencing. His white classmates refused to speak to him for 4 years. Not a word. Not at meals, not in classes, not in the barracks. 4 years of complete social isolation, designed to break him down and drive him out. He graduated anyway. He graduated 35th in a class of 276. He went on to become one of the most important military figures in American history. But before all of that, he was a cadet at Tuskegee, and then a commander, and then a legend. The 99th Pursuit Squadron shipped out to North Africa in April of 1943. They flew P-40 Warhawks, not the newest or most advanced fighters in the American arsenal, but capable aircraft in the right hands. And these were the right hands. Their first combat missions were over the Mediterranean, supporting Allied operations in Tunisia, and right away, the scrutiny was suffocating. Every mission was watched. Every outcome was analyzed, not just by military commanders, who were honestly trying to assess performance, but by those who had already decided on the conclusion and were looking for data to support it. Every mistake was magnified. Every success was minimized. And there were unfair comparisons being made. When a white pilot unit underperformed, it was seen as the result of specific circumstances. When a black pilot unit underperformed, it was cited as evidence of racial inferiority. The deck was stacked before the cards were dealt. Still, the 99th flew. They flew escort missions. They flew ground attack sorties. They flew in the brutal, unforgiving skies over North Africa, where the desert heat created thermal distortions, and the Luftwaffe's experienced pilots were always circling, always hunting. And then the reports started coming in. White commanders began filing assessments, suggesting the 99th was underperforming, that black pilots weren't aggressive enough in combat, that their situational awareness was lacking, that they broke formation too easily under fire. These reports made their way up the chain of command and eventually reached a War Department advisory committee that began seriously considering disbanding the entire black aviation program before it had really gotten started. What those reports conveniently ignored was context. The 99th had been given inferior equipment. They had been assigned to missions where air cover from experienced units was sometimes withdrawn. They had been denied the kind of mission briefings and tactical support that white units received as a matter of course. And when you looked at the actual numbers, the 99th's performance was comparable to other P-40 units in similar operational environments. But comparable wasn't good enough when the standard was designed to be impossible. Davis flew to Washington. He testified before the committee personally. He was calm. He was precise. He laid out the facts with the kind of controlled, surgical intensity that comes from years of being silenced and learning to make every single word count. He argued that the 99th deserved the chance to prove itself under fair conditions before being condemned. The committee was not entirely convinced, but they didn't shut the program down. Not yet. And in January of 1944, the Tuskegee Airmen got their chance. The Allied invasion of Sicily had come and gone. Now the push up the Italian peninsula was grinding forward, bloody and slow, through mountains and mud and German defensive lines that seemed to regenerate overnight. The Allied air campaign was critical. Long-range bombers had to reach deep into enemy territory, striking oil refineries, rail yards, industrial facilities, and those bombers were dying. German fighter pilots were devastating the bomber formations. Not just the famous aces like Erich Hartmann, whose kill count would eventually reach 352 confirmed aerial victories, but the broader Luftwaffe fighter force, men who had been flying combat missions since the Spanish Civil War, since the Battle of Britain, since the grinding nightmare of the Eastern Front. They were experienced, aggressive, and tactically sophisticated. Their preferred technique against bombers was to hit hard from the front, blazing through the formation, at closing speeds that gave gunners almost no time to respond, rolling through in a blur of cannon fire, and gone before the defending fighters could react. Allied bomber crews were losing men at a rate that was psychologically unsustainable. Some units faced casualty rates that meant statistically, if you flew enough missions, you were going to die. The losses weren't just aircraft and fuel and bombs. They were experienced pilots, navigators, bombardiers, men who had been trained at enormous expense and whose knowledge and skill could not be easily replaced. Every bomber lost meant fewer bombs on target. Every crew killed meant less pressure on Germany. The Luftwaffe didn't need to win the air war outright. They just needed to make the cost high enough that the Allies couldn't sustain the campaign. Into this environment, the redesignated 332nd Fighter Group arrived. The 99th was now part of a larger organization that included the 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons. 4 squadrons of black pilots, all trained at Tuskegee, all flying under Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had been promoted to command the group, and they were given P-47 Thunderbolts and, eventually, P-51 Mustangs, real fighters, fast, powerful, long-range aircraft capable of going deep with the bombers. They painted their aircraft tails red. Nobody told them to do it. There was no official regulation requiring a distinctive marking, but the 332nd painted their tail assemblies red, and then red spinners on the propellers, and in some cases, red noses on the cowlings. Some accounts say it was done for quick identification in formation. Some say it was a deliberate statement of identity, a visual declaration that these men were here, and they were not going anywhere. Whatever the reason, the red tails would become one of the most recognized markings in the history of aerial warfare. The bomber crews noticed, and they started requesting the red tails specifically. That detail is important, and it often gets lost. These were white bomber crews, men from every part of America, including the Deep South, men who had grown up in a segregated society and absorbed its assumptions and prejudices the way you absorb any environment you grow up in. And they were asking for the black pilots, not because they had experienced some dramatic conversion of conscience, because they were terrified of dying, and the word spreading through the bomber groups was that when you got the red tails, you came home. The 332nd's escort philosophy was different from some other groups. There was debate among fighter escort commanders about the best tactical approach. Some argued that the fighters should be aggressive, leaving the bomber formation to hunt German fighters at range and break up attacks before they developed. This could be effective, but it left the bombers exposed. Davis's approach was different. The 332nd stayed close. They maintained tight formation cover. They prioritized the safety of the bombers over personal kill counts. Pilots who broke formation to chase individual German aircraft were disciplined. The mission was to bring the bombers home, not to run up individual scores. This was a profound tactical decision, and it had an equally profound personal dimension. For these men, the mission wasn't just military, it was existential. Every bomber they brought home was evidence against the argument that black men couldn't be trusted in the air. Every crew they protected came back and told someone. The story spread through the bomber groups, the way all battlefield stories spread, through the specific, personal, unedited testimony of men who had seen something with their own eyes and felt the difference in their bones. The bombers came home. Mission after mission, the 332nd flew, and the bombers came home. And the German pilots, who had been hunting bomber formations with relative freedom, started encountering something they hadn't anticipated. A fighter escort that didn't wander, didn't get drawn off by decoys, didn't sacrifice the bombers for the glory of personal victories. They were disciplined, fast, skilled, and relentless. The engagements were fierce. On June 9, 1944, the 332nd flew escort on a mission to Munich. The German defenses were intense. Luftwaffe fighters intercepted the formation, and what followed was a brutal, swirling engagement over Bavaria in which the 332nd pilots shot down 5 German aircraft and damaged others, while the bomber formation pressed through. The mission was a success. The bombers reached their target, and the 332nd earned another mark in the ledger that was slowly, inexorably, building towards something nobody could ignore. But it wasn't just about numbers. It was about what the numbers meant in context. Because the Luftwaffe pilots they were facing weren't amateurs. The German fighter force in 1944 was depleted from years of combat, yes, but its core was still composed of veterans, men who had survived the Eastern Front, the Battle of Britain, the brutal attritional warfare over Germany itself, as Allied bombing campaigns intensified. These were pilots with hundreds of combat hours, pilots who had developed instincts that kept them alive in engagements that killed less experienced men within seconds. And they were flying good aircraft. The Focke-Wulf 190 was one of the finest fighter aircraft of the war. The Messerschmitt 109 variants, fielded in 1944, were still dangerous, fast, and highly maneuverable in the hands of an expert. The 332nd flew against all of it, and they held. Then came June 25, 1944, a mission to the Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Obertraubling, near Regensburg, deep inside Germany. A significant target, one the Germans would defend with everything they had. The 332nd flew escort for bombers hitting the factory. The Luftwaffe came up in force. The fighting was intense, and in the engagement that followed, the pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group shot down multiple enemy aircraft, damaged others, and kept the bomber formation intact through one of the most heavily defended targets in Germany. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern. Mission after mission, the 332nd performed with a consistency that should have been impossible to ignore. And then there was the June 9th engagement, and everything that followed, as the campaign rolled through the summer and fall of 1944. The 332nd flew missions over Romania, over France, over Greece, over Austria. They attacked shipping in the Adriatic. They destroyed railroad infrastructure. They bombed oil facilities that were the lifeblood of the German war machine. They were doing everything, not just escort duty, but the full range of tactical and strategic air operations. And then came one of the most remarkable single-day performances of the entire air war. March 24, 1945. The target was the Daimler-Benz tank manufacturing plant in Berlin. Not near Berlin. Berlin itself, the deepest penetration of German airspace by Allied bombers. A round trip of over 1,600 miles, pushing the absolute operational limits of the P-51 Mustang. The weather was brutal. The defenses were ferocious. German flak batteries surrounded the capital in overlapping fields of fire, and the Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had, including jets. The Messerschmitt 262 was a revelation, the world's first operational jet-powered combat aircraft. It flew at speeds that made the P-51 look slow. It outran everything the Allies put in the air. Shooting one down required either exceptional luck, catching one in the specific window of vulnerability around takeoff or landing when it was slow and exposed, or exceptional skill, leading it into a turning engagement where its poor low-speed maneuverability could be exploited by a disciplined piston-engine fighter pilot. The 332nd encountered Me-262s over Berlin that day, and 3 of the 332nd's pilots shot them down. 3 jet aircraft, the most advanced combat aircraft on the planet at that moment, destroyed by men flying propeller-driven Mustangs. Shot down because those men were better pilots, with better tactics, with the discipline and skill to exploit the narrow windows that the jets exposed. The bomber crews made it home. That mission earned the 332nd the Distinguished Unit Citation. By the time the war ended, the numbers had been compiled, the records reviewed, the claims verified. The 332nd Fighter Group had flown more than 1,500 missions. They had completed over 15,500 individual sorties. They had shot down 112 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. They had destroyed or damaged hundreds more on the ground. They had sunk a destroyer, something almost unheard of for a fighter group. They had received over 150 distinguished flying crosses. One pilot, Colonel Davis himself, had been awarded the Silver Star. And they had not lost a single bomber to enemy fighters while flying escort. Not one. Let's let that sit for a moment, because it's easy to say it quickly and move past it. But think about what it means. In the context of the air war over Europe, where bomber losses to fighter attack were devastating, where entire missions could see double-digit losses, where crews went out knowing statistically that some of them wouldn't come back, the 332nd flew escort, and the bombers came home. Every single time. That record has occasionally been debated by historians, examining the specific methodology of how losses were counted. and there are legitimate academic discussions about how to precisely define and verify that claim, given the documentation standards of the era. But even the most rigorous analyses confirm what nobody can honestly dispute. The 330 seconds record on bomber protection was extraordinary. It was statistically remarkable. It was, by any meaningful measure, the best in the theater. The German pilots had laughed, and now the accounting was done. But here's where the story gets more complicated. Because victory doesn't always lead to justice. Proof doesn't always change minds. The end of the war didn't end segregation in the American military. It didn't end the racism that had fought the Tuskegee program at every stage. The men came home, and many came home to the same Jim Crow laws, the same segregated buses, the same front doors they weren't allowed to enter. Some came back to their home states and were met with violence. In several documented cases, black veterans in uniform were attacked, threatened, and in some tragic instances, killed. The uniform they had earned in defense of a country that still didn't fully see them as citizens. The irony was staggering. These men had fought fascism abroad. They had proven their courage, their skill, their discipline, their sacrifice, under the most extreme conditions any human being can face. And they came home to a country that still debated whether they deserved equal rights. But they didn't stop fighting. They brought the battle home. The civil rights movement that gained momentum in the late 1940s and 1950s was fueled in part by the moral authority of black veterans who had served their country with distinction. President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948, which desegregated the United States military, was not given freely. It was demanded, and the Tuskegee Airmen were a critical part of the argument that made it impossible to refuse. You cannot send black men to fight and die for this country, and then tell them they are not equal citizens. The logical and moral contradiction was too stark. The proof was too vivid. The record was too real. Davis went on to become a general. Not a token promotion, not a symbolic gesture. He rose through the military establishment after integration with the same relentless excellence he had shown at West Point and over the skies of Europe. He eventually became the first black four-star general in the history of the United States Air Force. He had been silenced at West Point. He went on to help build the integrated Air Force that succeeded his segregated one. Now, let's go back to those individual pilots, because the history of the Tuskegee Airmen isn't just the story of the group. It's the story of specific men doing specific things in specific moments, and those moments deserve to be known. Take Charles McGee. McGee flew 136 combat missions with the 332nd during World War II. Later, he flew 100 missions in Korea, and then he flew 173 missions in Vietnam, a total of 409 combat missions across 3 wars. He was still alive to receive the Congressional Gold Medal in 2007 when the Tuskegee Airmen were collectively honored by Congress, and he was still being recognized in 2020 when he attended the State of the Union address at over 100 years old. He died in January 2022 at the age of 102. His record stands as one of the most remarkable in the history of American aviation. Period. Not with an asterisk, not qualified, just remarkable. Take Daniel Chappie James. James flew combat missions with the 332nd and went on to a career in the Air Force that eventually made him the first black 4-star general in any branch of the United States military. He flew more than 100 combat missions in Korea and 78 in Vietnam. He was a commander, a tactician, a public figure who spoke with the kind of uncompromising directness about both America's ideals and its failures that made some people uncomfortable and others inspired. He became a symbol not just of what Black Americans could achieve, but of what America could be when it stopped lying to itself. Take Lee Archer. Archer was one of the closest things the 332nd had to a traditional ace, the term used for a pilot who has shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft. There is some historical debate about exactly how many confirmed air-to-air kills he had, with official records crediting him with 4 confirmed and records or accounts suggesting more, and whether he crossed the threshold to official ace status depends on which documentation you accept. But everyone who flew with him and everyone who studied the record agrees that Archer was exceptional. He was aggressive, precise, and had the kind of natural flying instinct that can't be fully taught. He was one of the most dangerous fighter pilots the 332nd had, one of the most dangerous in the theater. Take Roscoe Brown. Brown shot down an Me-262 jet over Berlin on March 24, 1945. He was 23 years old. He was flying a propeller-driven Mustang. The German pilot was flying the most advanced combat aircraft on the planet, and Brown shot him down. In his own later accounts, Brown described the engagement with clarity and a kind of quiet satisfaction that speaks to what it meant. He saw the jet. He calculated the angles. He understood the vulnerability. He waited, and when the moment came, he executed. After the war, Brown went on to earn a PhD from New York University, became an educator and academic, and remained an advocate for the Tuskegee Airmen's legacy until his death in 2016. He was 94 years old. Take Louis Purnell. Purnell flew combat missions with the 332nd and is often cited in memoirs and interviews for the particular kind of steel that these men carried with them constantly. Because flying combat missions is dangerous for everyone, but flying combat missions in 1944 as a Black American carried an additional layer of existential weight that is hard to fully comprehend. The knowledge that if you were shot down over enemy territory and captured by German forces, you would be a prisoner of war with the protections of the Geneva Convention, at least in theory. But if you were shot down and captured in the American South, you might not have those protections from your own countrymen. Some Tuskegee airmen were killed or threatened after returning to American soil. The enemy wasn't only across the ocean. That knowledge, that double threat, didn't stop them. It may have made them more determined. The psychological dimension of what these men endured is something historians have only recently begun to fully grapple with. There was the constant need to be perfect, not just good, not just adequate, not just the equal of white pilots, but visibly, undeniably superior, because anything less would be used against them. There was the constant documentation of their accomplishments, not just for military records, but as evidence in an ongoing argument about their humanity and their worth. There was the institutional racism they faced every day on the base, in the towns near the bases, in the country they went home to. They were fighting a war on multiple fronts simultaneously, and only one of those fronts was in the sky over Europe. There's a story, often cited in discussions of the Tuskegee program, of a group of Tuskegee airmen returning to Freeman Field in Indiana in 1945 and attempting to use the officers' club that had been designated for white officers only. They were arrested. Over 100 officers were detained. The incident became known as the Freeman Field Mutiny, though mutiny is a wildly inaccurate characterization of what was actually a deliberate, organized act of civil disobedience by men who held military commissions and were being denied the rights those commissions should have guaranteed them. One of the men arrested, Theodore Branch, later said that they decided they were going to demand the rights they had earned, regardless of consequences. The incident generated national attention. It contributed to the pressure that eventually led to Truman's desegregation order. And the men who stood up that day paid a real price. Some had negative notations in their records. Some faced professional consequences that followed them for years. They stood up anyway. That's the full picture of who the Tuskegee Airmen were. Not just fighter pilots, not just medal winners, not just the people who made the statistics. They were human beings navigating an impossible situation with a grace and determination that should be frankly humbling to anyone who examines it closely. Now let's talk about the combat environment they were flying in, because to fully appreciate what they accomplished, you need to understand what the skies over Europe in 1944 and 1945 were actually like. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany was one of the most costly operations of the entire war. The 8th Air Force, flying from England, and the 15th Air Force, flying from Italy, were throwing hundreds of bombers at Germany on missions that could last 8, 10, 12 hours in freezing, unpressurized aircraft at altitudes above 20,000 feet, where the air was so thin that pure oxygen was required just to stay conscious. The bombers flew in tight defensive formations, box formations, designed so that the gun coverage of each aircraft overlapped with its neighbors. In theory, any German fighter approaching from any angle would face withering defensive fire. In practice, experienced German pilots found the weak spots. The frontal attack that closed at nearly 600 miles per hour gave bomber gunners almost no reaction time. The high-side attack exploited the limited upward visibility of most gunners, and the coordinated attack by multiple fighters who could saturate a defensive formation's ability to respond simultaneously was particularly brutal. The flak was even more terrifying. German anti-aircraft artillery by 1944 was the most sophisticated in the world. The 88mm flak gun was a terrifying weapon that fired shells capable of reaching bomber altitude with precision fusing that could detonate at a preset height. Bomber crews flew into flak fields that turned the sky black with explosions. The shrapnel was razor-edged and flew in all directions at lethal velocities. You couldn't maneuver around flak the way you could maneuver around a fighter, not without breaking formation and becoming even more vulnerable. You had to fly through it, straight and level, maintaining your bombing run, while the air around you turned to lethal flying metal. The casualty rates were devastating. The 8th Air Force, in some periods of the campaign, was losing more than 10% of its aircraft on individual missions. That means statistically, if you flew 10 missions, you expected to lose your aircraft once. The required tour of duty was 25 missions in the early period, then 35. The math was brutal. Some crews didn't make it past 5 or 6. This is the environment the 332nd operated in. Not in a protective bubble, not with special protections, not with a margin of safety that other units didn't have. The same flak, the same German fighters, the same killing cold at altitude, the same terror and the same death. And they flew it, day after day. The P-51 Mustang, which became the 332nd's primary aircraft from 1944 onward, was a genuinely exceptional machine, and it deserves its own acknowledgement in this story. The Mustang combined the airframe originally developed by North American Aviation with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and the result was one of the finest fighter aircraft produced by any nation in the entire war. It was fast, with a top speed over 400 miles per hour. It was long-ranged, capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back from Italian bases. It was maneuverable at high altitudes, where other fighters struggled, and it was rugged enough to bring pilots home with significant battle damage. But an aircraft is only as good as the person flying it, and the people flying the red-tailed Mustangs were exceptional. Part of that was the selection process at Tuskegee, which, as noted earlier, applied extremely high standards to its trainees out of a combination of institutional pride and the specific pressure of representing something larger than individual careers. Part of it was the leadership of Davis, whose own exceptional abilities as a pilot and commander set a tone that permeated the entire group. And part of it was simply the men themselves, their intelligence, their physical capability, their coordination, the things that make a great pilot, all present in abundance. There's also something worth acknowledging about motivation. The 332nd's pilots weren't just fighting for survival in the abstract way that all combat soldiers fight for survival. They were fighting to prove something. That motivation cuts both ways. It can create pressure that breaks people, but when it doesn't break you, it can create a focused intensity that elevates performance. The pilots of the 332nd had something to prove that their white counterparts did not, and they proved it. The German pilots they faced deserve acknowledgement too, not out of any misguided admiration, but because an honest assessment of what the 332nd accomplished requires understanding who they were fighting against. The Luftwaffe, by 1944, was stretched thin. The Eastern Front alone had consumed hundreds of experienced pilots in grinding, brutal attritional warfare. The Battle of Britain had cost Germany irreplaceable veterans. The sustained Allied bombing campaign was forcing Germany to consume new pilots faster than it could train them to replacement quality. By 1944, average German fighter pilot experience was declining. But not at the top. The highest-scoring German aces were still flying. Men like Erich Hartmann, Gerhard Barkhorn, Günter Rall, and more broadly, Germany's fighter defense system over the Reich was staffed by men who had been flying combat longer than almost any other pilots in the war. They had developed instincts and techniques that were refined by years of real combat. Meeting one of them in the air was a genuinely lethal proposition. The 332nd fought these men, and won. Let's be specific about those 112 aerial victories, because the number deserves some context. An aerial victory, or kill, in military aviation is one of the most carefully documented and verified achievements in warfare. It requires not just the pilot's claim, but corroboration, either from other witnesses, gun camera footage, or post-mission intelligence confirming the destruction of the aircraft. The standards were stringent, precisely because overclaiming was common across all air forces. Claims would be made in the chaos of combat that turned out to be inaccurate upon review. The 112 credited to the 332nd represent confirmed, verified kills. Spread across the missions they flew, from their arrival in theater through the end of the war, 112 confirmed kills against a Luftwaffe that the entire Allied air forces were struggling to suppress represents a significant contribution. And this is before accounting for the aircraft damaged, the ground vehicles destroyed, the trains wrecked, the airfields attacked, the shipping sunk. The aerial kill count is just one measure, and not even the most important one, to the bomber crews who survived because of the red tails. The destroyed Daimler-Benz plant, the suppressed oil refineries, the disrupted railroad lines across Romania and Hungary and Austria, the shipping in the Adriatic that would never deliver its cargo, the German industrial capacity that was degraded by months of precise, sustained operations. All of this contributed to the Allied war effort in ways that don't show up in the aerial kill count, but were absolutely real in their strategic impact. The mission on June 25, 1944, to Ploiești, Romania, one of Germany's most critical oil supplies, was a perfect example. The 332nd flew escort for bombers targeting the Ploiești oil refineries, which had been hit repeatedly by Allied forces at enormous cost, including some of the most costly individual bombing missions of the entire war. The defenses around Ploiești were among the heaviest in Europe. The Germans had concentrated flak batteries around these facilities because they knew how critical they were. Attacking Ploiești meant flying into a deliberately created killing ground. The 332nd flew it. They fought through the defenses. They kept the bombers together. And then, on the return journey, something remarkable happened. The 332nd pilots spotted German vessels in the harbor at Constanța, on the Romanian coast. Without specific orders to attack shipping, they evaluated the tactical situation and executed a strafing attack on the ships, destroying a German destroyer escort vessel and damaging others. A fighter group destroyed a naval destroyer. That doesn't happen. Destroyers are built to fight, armed with anti-aircraft guns, and capable of putting up serious defensive fire against attacking aircraft. And the 332nd took one out with machine gun fire from P-51 Mustangs. That detail captures something essential about these men. It wasn't just that they followed orders well. It was that they were tactically intelligent, opportunistic in the best sense, and capable of exercising judgment under fire that produced results beyond what anyone had planned. That's what elite military units do. Now, there's a broader historical point that needs to be made here, because the story of the Tuskegee Airmen doesn't exist in isolation. It exists within a larger story about who is allowed to prove their worth and under what conditions. The argument against allowing black pilots in the Army Air Corps wasn't just that black men couldn't fly. The argument was structural. It was a system designed to prevent success and then point to the absence of success as evidence that the barriers were justified. This is a pattern that appears throughout history, wherever dominant groups erect barriers against excluded groups. The excluded group can't succeed because the path to success is blocked. The dominant group then points to the absence of success as proof that the exclusion was warranted. The circularity is the point. It's designed to be self-perpetuating. The Tuskegee Airmen broke that loop, not because they were given a fair chance. They weren't, but because they were good enough to succeed even under conditions specifically designed to limit them, and because the world they were succeeding in was one where the standard of evidence was real, physical, documented, and couldn't be talked away. Aerial combat is one of the most brutally meritocratic environments imaginable. The sky doesn't care about your race. Gravity doesn't care. An enemy pilot's cannon shells don't care. You either fly well enough to survive and accomplish the mission, or you don't. And when the Tuskegee Airmen flew well enough to accomplish missions that the people who sent them there had assumed they would fail, the evidence was undeniable. which didn't stop people from trying to deny it. There were officers who minimized the accomplishments. There were reports that attributed the 3:30 seconds performance to exceptional luck or to specific circumstances that wouldn't generalize. There were people who found ways to qualify the achievement, to put asterisks on it, to keep it from being the simple, clear proof it actually was. But evidence accumulates. Testimonies pile up. Bomber crews who had flown with the 3:30 seconds protection, who had landed safely on missions they didn't expect to survive, went home and told people. That kind of testimony doesn't stay quiet. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen became known while the war was still being fought. Not broadly, not in every living room in America, but in the tight world of military aviation, the reputation of the Red Tails spread quickly. By the end of 1944, the 330 Seconds, standing as one of the most effective fighter groups in the 15th Air Force, was established by people who had seen the work firsthand. After the war, the story fought its own battle for recognition. The Tuskegee Airmen's official history was complicated by the same institutional racism that had fought the program from the beginning. Records were sometimes incomplete. Credit was sometimes misattributed. The broader narrative of the air war over Europe, as it was told in the immediate post-war years, centered primarily on white units and white pilots. But the survivors knew, and they told their stories. To their children, their grandchildren, their communities. The story lived in the places where official histories didn't reach, in the specific memories of men who had been there, carried in the particular way that lived experience is always more real than the sanitized version that ends up in textbooks. By the 1990s, the recognition was beginning to arrive, belatedly, imperfectly, but genuinely. The documentary work, the books, the interviews with aging veterans whose memories were still precise and whose pride was entirely earned. By 2007, when Congress awarded the Tuskegee Airmen the Congressional Gold Medal, there was a ceremony that brought together those who were still alive, men in their 80s and 90s who had spent decades watching their achievement be footnoted when it deserved headlines. George W. Bush, whatever one thinks of his presidency, spoke that day about what these men had done and what it meant. And perhaps more importantly, many of the surviving Tuskegee Airmen spoke for themselves, with the kind of measured, dignified authority that comes from knowing exactly what you did and what it cost and what it was worth. The 2012 film Red Tails, produced by George Lucas, brought the story to a new generation in Hollywood terms, with the aerial combat sequences rendered with a visual flair that captured something of the drama and intensity of what those flights had been. The film was imperfect, as dramatizations always are, compressed and simplified, and occasionally melodramatic, but it introduced the Tuskegee Airmen to millions of people who hadn't known their story. And for that, whatever its cinematic limitations, it served a real purpose. But the real story is better than the movie. It always is. The real story is Benjamin O. Davis Jr. sitting in 4 years of silence at West Point and deciding that he would not leave, that he would stay, and he would excel, and he would earn what he had come for, not out of stubbornness alone, but out of an understanding that the people who were trying to drive him out were wrong, and that the best possible answer to their wrongness was his continued presence and continued achievement. The real story is those 5 graduates, in March of 1942, standing on a runway in Alabama, knowing that they had just done something that the United States Army had spent years claiming was impossible, and knowing that this was only the beginning. The real story is the bomber crews who came back alive from Berlin, and when people